So, Gandalf, you tried to lead them over Garadras. And if that fails, where then will you go?
We must get up the mountain! Make for the camp of Rohan!
Hey guys, today's theory is going to be a good one, so enjoy the ride. In the Fellowship of the Ring, the company passed through the mountain Caradhras. However, from the intel gathered from the Crabine spies of Dunland, Saruman the Wise concluded that the company, led by his latest enemy Gandalf, would be venturing through the Misty Mountains. Subsequently, Saruman commanded the mountain to fall, forcing the company no choice other than to abandon their path for a new one. If you're familiar with the books, you know there is more to the story than that. Although for the purposes for theory narratives, we'll stick prominently to adaptation themes whilst keeping it as canon as possible. We all know the eventual road that the gang takes and how the story pens from there. However, what if, instead of entering the mines of Moria as the Ringbearer decided, Frodo and therefore the company chose to take the road south from the Misty Mountains all the way through to the Gap of Rohan? So, after the Fellowship gathered themselves up from the snow which had encased them, they begin travelling down the mountain. When they reach the bottom of Caradhras, they begin travelling south. After a short distance in comparison to their journey, they face their first hurdle, crossing the river known as the Glanduin. The Glanduin was a small river in Eriador, running east to west into the Misty Mountains. Being the spearhead of the company, Gandalf leads the way, persuasively convincing the companions that they must all enter the water in order to reach the other side. The Fellowship prepare to begin entering the river, knowing that their supplies and rations were destined to become saturated. They gathered around the river and began waterproofing their food rations to prevent them from being inconsumable. Gandalf and Aragorn noticed that Sam was extremely hesitant. Strider approached the halfling to see if everything was okay. Samwise began to stutter. Well, it's just that Frodo interrupted his friend, whispering to Aragorn, "He can't swim." The ranger was puzzled. Gandalf, who had been observing their dialogue, stepped in. "Ah, very well," said the wizard, counseling Aragorn, Legolas, Gimli and Boromir to cut down some of the old trees so they could begin to design a raft. Gimli led the way with his axe ready in his hands, furiously chopping at nearby trees and bringing them down with little effort. Once all the required wood was gathered, Gandalf hovered his brown staff over the pieces, and one by one he bound them together. "Handy in a tight spot, this lad," Gimli whispered to Legolas. The elf and the others gazed in astonishment at the wizard's witchcraft. The raft came in quite useful when it was ready. It was light in weight, and yet thanks to the wizard's magic, it was sturdy. Sam sat comfortably in the middle of the raft. Surrounding him, they placed provisions, which they wished to keep as dry as possible. On the night of January the 14th, the company finally began travelling across the Glanduin. Frodo could feel a heavy weight pulling down on his neck as the ring was attempting to abandon him, as it had done to its previous possessors. He did not mention this to Gandalf, who was floating next to him. The ring was now beginning to take a hold of Frodo's mind. Arriving on the other side, wet and uncomfortable, after approximately 3 hours in the water, they begin immediately preparing a fire to dry themselves and their provisions before resting the night on the southern shore of the Glanduin River. For the Fellowship's voyage to the Gap of Rohan, they had to march through wild and untamed lands for approximately 300 miles. They could have chosen to travel southeast, although with the treason of Saruman apparent and his spies plentiful, they would have soon been discovered if they were to take the north-south road. This would have taken them approximately 1 month of wilderness travel. So let's say on the 15th of February, they would have finally reached the borders of Dunland. Along the way, they survived by eating scraps and pieces of what they could find, drinking and gathering rainwater when they had the opportunity to do so. Finally arriving at Dunland, the company was exhausted and malnourished. The Wildmen of the West had been allied with Saruman by this stage of their quest, and were openly the enemy of Rohan. On February the 17th, the company had been spotted by scouts of Dunland. Within hours of their sighting, vast swaths of Wildmen advanced towards the Fellowship, and despite their stance, their numbers were few, and the Wildmen were many. Sieging the company, they had no choice but to surrender. It was at this moment Gandalf guided Frodo to the center of the group. The wizard, the men, and elf were enclosed around the ring-bearer, obstructing the Dunlanders' view of Frodo. Gandalf commanded Frodo to immediately use the ring so he could disappear. There was simply too much on the line for Middle-earth. The halfling interjected. However, Gandalf had a fierce look in his eyes. Frodo had a brief glance at his fellow halflings. Their eyes were teary and bewildered, as was the ring-bearers. Merry, Pippin, and Sam collectively gasped as Frodo vanished. Due to its gloomy and woeful appearance, the neighbouring Rohirrim coined the name Dunland, which translates to Darkland in their tongue, and it was never as before apparent to Frodo as it was in the present moment, since he had now entered the Wraith world. Spotting an opening leading to a thin alleyway, Frodo dashes into and across the corridor. Looking behind, he witnesses the companions being disarmed and their hands being bound, slowly walking away on command by the spear-wielding maniacs. Frodo was alone. Not even Sam was with him. This was his moment. He couldn't leave his friends to torment. Thinking back, Frodo thought of a story dating back around 78 years. It was the impossible task that his uncle Bilbo had accomplished with his dwarven companions in the dungeons of Mirkwood. This gave Frodo optimism. Taking off the ring and darting back to where his companions once stood, Frodo stealthily began stalking the prisoners. That's where today's video will end. If you did enjoy it, I demand that you like it, because if it reaches 100 likes, I'll make a part 2, and I'm really excited and enthusiastic for the second part of this theory. Also, let me know in the comments below where you believe the story should go from here, and if you have any theories that you would like covered, you can always drop video suggestion ideas in the comment section below. I hope you're having a great day wherever you are, and as always, my Middle-earth friends, Hadonlay for watching, and I'll see you in the next episode of Lord of the Rings Theory.
Embrace the power of the ring, or embrace your own destruction.
Renewed shall be blade that was broken. The crownless again shall be king.